My husband walked into our luxury penthouse, slapped signed divorce papers onto the dining table, and told me his 26-year-old mistress was waiting in the lobby. He smiled as he demanded his freedom to achieve greatness. He wanted to make sure I walked away with absolutely nothing, leaving me with a $2 million mortgage and a worthless shell company, just to humiliate me. He expected me to fall apart and beg him to stay. Instead, I signed the papers without shedding a single tear. He thought he had won. He had no idea that the worthless shell company he just forced me to take held the absolute legal rights to his entire tech empire. My name is Naomi. I am 34 years old and I am a wealth manager for the top 1%. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly outsmart someone who severely underestimated your intelligence. The view from our penthouse in downtown Atlanta was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a sea of glittering city lights, but the air inside our home was completely suffocating. I sat alone at our custom marble dining table, swirling a glass of dark red wine. The expensive steak dinner I had prepared was already turning cold on the plates. I listened to the sound of the private elevator opening. The heavy front door swung open, and Marcus walked in. He did not look like a husband coming home to his wife after a long day. He looked like a hostile corporate raider stepping into a boardroom to finalize a hostile takeover. At 36 years old, Marcus was the chief executive officer of a highly anticipated tech startup. He had built an electronic payment application that was currently the absolute obsession of the financial district. I watched him shrug off his tailored suit jacket. He did not apologize for being late. He did not even glance at the dinner I had made. He just walked straight up to the table and threw a thick stack of legal documents right next to my wine glass. The divorce papers were already signed and stamped by his aggressive legal team. Marcus stood over me with a deeply arrogant smirk on his face. He adjusted his heavy gold watch and looked down at me as if I were a bad investment he was finally cutting loose. "I am done, Naomi," he said. His voice was completely empty of the love he used to show me. "Chloe is waiting for me down in the lobby right now. I need my freedom to achieve true greatness, and I cannot have you dragging me down anymore." I looked at the thick stack of papers and then back up at his face. We had been together for 8 years. I paid our rent when he was just a struggling guy with a cheap laptop in a dusty garage. Now that he was wearing $1,000 shoes and driving a luxury sports car, he suddenly needed to be free. Chloe was a 26-year-old lifestyle influencer. She cared more about luxury handbags and her social media followers than building a real foundation. Marcus told me I was too rigid and too obsessed with spreadsheets to understand his creative genius, but I did not scream at him. I did not throw my wine in his face. As a risk management consultant, I never let emotions dictate my financial actions. I simply took a slow sip of my wine and asked him what his terms were. Marcus pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat across from me. He leaned forward with the blinding confidence of a man who thought he had outsmarted the entire world. He told me he was taking the startup completely. He was taking all the liquid assets he had already drained and moved to offshore accounts over the past few months. He demanded a clean break. No alimony and absolutely no spousal support. In return, he said he was generously leaving me the old property my family had passed down to me. The massive catch was that my family home currently carried a $2 million mortgage. I had taken out that massive loan years ago specifically to fund his early seed rounds when no bank would even look at him. He actually laughed out loud as he pointed out my massive debt. He told me he was being incredibly kind by not forcing a sale of the property just to take half the equity. Then he flipped to the very last page of the document. He tapped his finger heavily on a specific clause near the bottom. "And just to show you I am not a monster, I am giving you sole ownership of N&C Holdings," he said with a cruel laugh. N&C Holdings was a shell company. It was a limited liability company that generated absolutely zero revenue. Marcus had tossed it to me like a useless scrap of meat to a starving dog. He thought it was just a meaningless piece of paper. He thought he was walking away with millions of dollars while leaving me drowning in massive debt and managing a total ghost company. He wanted me to suffer. He wanted me to feel the full, crushing weight of his supposed genius. "Sign it, Naomi," he demanded. "Let us stop pretending you belong in my high-paced world anymore. Just sign the papers and go figure out how you are going to pay that massive mortgage on a boring consultant salary." I looked deeply into the eyes of the man I had supported for years. He was so blinded by his own towering ego that he never bothered to look under the hood of his own business structure. He assumed my silence was defeat. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the table. I did not hesitate. I did not ask for a single penny more. I smiled slightly and signed my name on the dotted line. Marcus snatched the papers back instantly, as if I might change my mind. He practically strutted out of the penthouse, leaving me sitting alone in the quiet dining room. He thought he had completely destroyed my future, but as I took another sip of my wine, I could not help but smile. He was so desperate to marry his young influencer that he had legally severed all ties and waived all rights to N&C Holdings. He just handed me absolute legal control over his entire software source code. He just did not know it yet. The heavy front door did not even have time to click shut before it was violently pushed open again. I was still holding the gold pen when Shirley marched into my foyer. At 60 years old, my mother-in-law was draped in expensive cashmere and thick gold jewelry. Jewelry that was paid for by the credit card I diligently cleared at the end of every single month. She did not bother to knock or wipe her designer boots on the mat. Instead, she aggressively dragged 3 massive luxury suitcases right across my polished hardwood floors. She stopped in the center of the living room and glared at me with a look of absolute disgust. "I see my son finally handed you the papers," she snapped. Her eyes darted to the signed documents resting next to my wine glass. A triumphant smile spread across her wrinkled face. Without waiting for an invitation, she marched straight past me and headed directly into the master bedroom. I calmly placed the pen down and followed her to the doorway. Shirley threw open the custom walk-in closet and began violently yanking Marcus's expensive suits off their velvet hangers. She tossed them haphazardly into the open suitcases. I leaned against the doorframe and watched her pack his things. She was acting as if she were rescuing a hostage from a terrible prison. "You know, Naomi, my son is a true visionary," she said, without looking back at me. "He is a self-made tech genius. He built a multi-million-dollar empire from the absolute ground up. He manifested his success through pure brilliance while you were just sitting at a desk punching numbers into a calculator." I listened to her rewrite history right in front of my face. Through Shirley's eyes, Marcus was a glittering god who had conquered the business world entirely on his own. She conveniently erased the years I worked double shifts to keep our electricity on. She completely forgot that I used my own savings to buy the high-speed servers he needed to write his very first lines of code. In her mind, I was nothing but a lucky leech. To her, I was just a desperate woman who had attached herself to a rising star before he realized his true market value. "You should be down on your knees thanking him for leaving you this house," Shirley spat, as she shoved a pile of silk ties into a side pocket. "Even with that massive mortgage, you are lucky he did not throw you out onto the street. You have squeezed enough out of his pockets all these years. It is time you step aside for a woman who actually fits into his new world." She turned to face me and looked me up and down with intense judgment. "A woman who buries her nose in boring spreadsheets is not fit for a tech genius chief executive officer," she sneered. "You lack the grace for high society. You do not understand networking or public relations. You do not even care about building a personal brand." Chloe knows exactly how to handle his public image. She knows how to smile for the cameras and charm the investors. All you know how to do is nag him about budgets and risk management. You are suffocating his potential. I did not defend my career. There was no point in explaining to a woman who had never worked a day in her life that wealth management for the top 1% was not just punching numbers into a calculator. I held the keys to financial doors that Marcus did not even know existed, but I let her talk. I let her reveal every ugly thought she and her son had been whispering behind my back for months. Shirley zipped up the first suitcase with a loud, aggressive sound. She grabbed the handle of the second bag and locked her eyes directly onto mine. She was preparing to deliver what she thought would be the ultimate death blow. Besides, she said, lowering her voice into a cruel whisper, Marcus needs a real heir for his legacy. Chloe is already carrying my grandson. It is something you were far too busy with your little consulting job to ever give him. She paused and waited for my reaction. She wanted to see my face crumble. She wanted me to fall to the floor and sob over the fact that another woman was giving my husband the child we had delayed having. She wanted the satisfaction of utterly breaking me. I stood perfectly still. I looked at the smug satisfaction practically radiating from her pores. Congratulations, Shirley, I said with a completely flat and steady voice. I am sure a newborn baby is exactly what a startup founder needs right before a major venture capital funding round. Tell Marcus I wish him all the luck in the world balancing late-night feedings with board meetings. Shirley scoffed, clearly annoyed that I was not having a nervous breakdown in her presence. You are so incredibly bitter, Naomi. It is honestly pathetic. She aggressively zipped up the remaining suitcases and dragged them toward the front door. The wheels scraped loudly against the wood, echoing through the silent apartment. She paused with her hand on the brass doorknob and shot me one final look of pure contempt. Do not expect an invitation to the wedding, she snapped, and do not try to call him crying when the bank comes to foreclose on this dump. He changed his phone number this morning. The heavy door slammed shut behind her. The sudden silence in the penthouse was deafening. I walked slowly back to the dining table. I picked up my wineglass and carried it into the kitchen. I poured the dark red liquid down the stainless steel sink and watched it swirl down the drain. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They thought they had discarded a boring accountant who was drowning in debt. They had no idea that the silent woman they just humiliated was holding the detonator to their entire fake empire. I pulled out my phone and drafted a highly encrypted message to my private legal team. The game had not even started yet. The very next morning, I walked into the towering glass skyscraper that housed the most expensive corporate law firm in Atlanta. Marcus had summoned me to finalize the binding separation agreement. The papers he had thrown at me the night before were just the initial petition, but he was in a massive rush to make everything permanent. He wanted the final settlement signed and notarized immediately so he could officially marry his young influencer without any lingering financial baggage. I stepped into the massive conference room. It smelled like expensive leather and toxic arrogance. Marcus was already sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. He was aggressively typing on his phone and probably texting Chloe about her wedding dress fitting. Sitting right next to him was his lead attorney. The man wore a custom suit and looked at me with the kind of fake pity usually reserved for discarded wives. Marcus did not even bother to look up from his screen when I took my seat. His attorney cleared his throat and slid a thick bound document across the polished wood table toward me. The lawyer explained that they had expedited the paperwork overnight. He pointed a silver pen at a specific paragraph on the third page. He explained that in exchange for me absorbing the $2 million mortgage debt, Marcus was formally transferring 100% ownership of a limited liability company called N&C Holdings directly to me. Marcus finally put his phone face down on the table and laughed. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and tossed a thin manila folder across the table. It landed right in front of me. Take that garbage company as a parting gift, Naomi, he said with a deeply mocking tone. It is a completely worthless shell. It generates zero revenue and has zero employees. But it will make me feel a lot better to know that you are technically a business owner just like me. I looked down at the manila folder without changing my facial expression. Marcus was a man who only cared about being featured on magazine covers and attending high-profile networking events. He was utterly obsessed with being perceived as a tech visionary, but he hated paperwork. He hated the boring legal structures and the tedious administrative details that actually ran his business. 5 years ago, when he was just starting to build his payment application, he had terrible credit and a mountain of student debt. No bank would give him a loan, and no investor would take him seriously. So I used my own pristine credit score and my own personal savings to establish N&C Holdings. I paid the best intellectual property lawyers in the state to register every single line of his software code under that specific company. Then I drafted a rock-solid licensing agreement that allowed his public-facing startup to use the software for exactly $1 a year. He signed it back then without ever reading the fine print. N stood for Naomi and C stood for code. He was so obsessed with his own genius that he never even bothered to ask what the letters meant. The attorney impatiently tapped his silver pen against the table. I flipped to the page outlining the clean break agreement. The wording was absolute perfection. It stated clearly that upon signing, both parties waived all current and future rights to any assets, intellectual property, or future earnings associated with the other person's solely owned entities. Marcus was desperate to close a $50 million venture capital funding round next week. His investors required a perfectly clean cap table and absolutely zero pending litigation from a bitter ex-wife. Marcus wanted to make absolutely sure I could never touch the millions of dollars he was about to receive. He thought he was building a massive iron wall to keep me out. He just did not realize he was locking himself on the outside of his own castle. The intellectual property was the absolute backbone of his entire payment application. Without that source code, his app was just a pretty graphic interface that did absolutely nothing. "Are you going to sign it, or are you going to sit there and cry all morning?" Marcus asked with heavy annoyance. He aggressively tapped his heavy gold watch. "Chloe has a bridal fitting at noon, and I am paying for it, so let us wrap this up right now. From now on, what is mine is mine. Clean break." I did not shed a single tear. I did not show a single ounce of hesitation. I slowly pulled my favorite pen from my designer bag. I read the clean break clause one more time just to savor the absolute brilliance of his fatal mistake. I smiled. It was a genuine bright smile that completely confused his expensive lawyer. I pressed my pen to the heavy paper and signed my name with a beautiful sweeping flourish. Marcus snatched the document the second my pen lifted from the page. He handed it directly to his lawyer, who quickly stamped it with an official notary seal. It was done. It was legally binding and completely irreversible. Marcus stood up and buttoned his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at me with ultimate victory shining in his dark eyes. "Enjoy your empty house and your garbage company, Naomi," he said with a smug grin. "Try not to miss me too much." He turned around and walked out of the glass conference room with his lawyer trailing right behind him like an obedient dog. They strutted down the hallway laughing loudly together. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone at the massive mahogany table. I slowly closed the manila folder and placed it carefully into my bag. If this were a movie, the camera would push in right now to capture the exact moment my smile turned to pure ice. Marcus wanted a clean break. He was about to find out very soon that his multi-million-dollar tech empire was completely hollow, and I was the one holding the only key to the vault. Exactly 7 days after the heavy glass doors of the law firm closed behind me, I was sitting at my custom desk. My private office was located on the highest floor of a secure financial high-rise in the center of the city. I kept my immediate surroundings completely strictly confidential. To the outside world and to my former husband, I was just a boring consultant struggling to pay a massive mortgage. I intended to keep that illusion perfectly intact until the exact right moment. My phone buzzed against the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. It was not a client emergency or an urgent market update from my team. It was an electronic wedding invitation. An e-vite sent directly to my personal email address. I opened the digital envelope and stared at the glittering gold font dancing across my screen. Marcus and Chloe cordially invited me to witness their spectacular union at one of the most exclusive historical estates in Atlanta. The audacity to invite the woman you just divorced to your wedding a week later was astounding, but the real venom was hidden at the very bottom of the page. Attached to the formal invitation was a personalized note. I read the words slowly. Sorry you were too old and boring to keep a king. Hope the bank has not kicked you out of that dump yet. Chloe had actually taken the time to type out those exact words. She wanted to make sure I felt the intense sting of her supposed victory. She wanted to remind me that she had won the grand prize while I was left with nothing but crippling debt. Instead of throwing my phone across the room in a fit of rage, I simply tapped the link to her social media profile attached to the bottom of the email. Chloe was currently broadcasting live to hundreds of thousands of followers. I watched her perfectly filtered face fill my screen. She was sitting in the back of a chauffeured luxury SUV sipping expensive champagne and giggling directly into the camera lens. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves, and her makeup was professionally contoured to highlight her youth. But the absolute main star of her broadcast was the massive diamond ring sitting heavy on her left hand. She held her hand up to the camera, making sure the afternoon sunlight hit the diamond perfectly. Thank you all so much for the love and the congratulations, she cooed to her viewers. My king really outdid himself this time. He knows that a woman of high value deserves the absolute best in life. She paused to take another sip of champagne and let out a highly dramatic sigh. I am just so incredibly glad we can finally move forward and plan our future. It has been so exhausting dealing with all the negative energy from his past. You know exactly how it is, guys. Sometimes you have to forcefully remove an old, stubborn obstacle before you can build a real empire. The old, stubborn obstacle. She was talking about me. Her comment section was instantly flooding with fire emojis and messages of support from strangers who had absolutely no idea who I was or what I had sacrificed to build Marcus from the ground up. I watched the comments roll in praising her beauty and congratulating her on securing a wealthy tech chief executive officer. Chloe continued to talk endlessly about the wedding details. She bragged about the imported white orchids they were flying in from overseas. She boasted about the celebrity chef they had hired to cater the reception and the custom designer gown she was flying to Paris to pick up this weekend. She was spending money like water. She was throwing Marcus's startup funds around as if the well would never run dry. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched her perform her little victory dance. As a wealth manager, I analyzed people and their spending habits for a living. I looked at Chloe, and I did not see a glamorous rival who had stolen my husband. I saw a highly volatile and rapidly depreciating asset. She was a walking liability, attached to a man whose entire net worth was built on a legal technicality he had just willingly surrendered. The diamond ring she was flashing on the screen was undoubtedly paid for with funds Marcus had secured, based on the massive valuation of his software. Software that was now legally and exclusively owned by my completely hidden shell company. Chloe leaned closer to her phone camera and lowered her voice as if she were sharing a deep, intimate secret with her devoted followers. Ladies never ever settle for a man who lets a bitter ex-wife drag him down, she whispered with a fake pout. Marcus is a true visionary. He is a builder. He needed someone who matches his intense ambition, not someone who just sits at a desk and complains about budgets and risk management all day. He is about to close the biggest funding round in tech history next week, and we are going to celebrate our wedding like absolute royalty. We are leaving the dead weight behind where it belongs. She blew a kiss to the camera and ended the live broadcast. The screen faded to black, leaving only the quiet hum of my office air conditioning. The dead weight. I smiled and locked my phone screen. I let the darkness of the glass reflect my own calm and collected expression. Chloe was right about one specific thing. Marcus was indeed about to experience the biggest financial event of his entire life next week. She just had the direction of the cash flow completely wrong. They were planning a multi-million-dollar wedding funded entirely by the fragile illusion of a tech empire. They were happily dancing on the deck of a sinking ship and celebrating the fact that they had just thrown their only life raft overboard. I placed my phone face down on the desk. Let them buy the imported orchids. Let them fly to Paris for the dress. The higher they climbed into the clouds of high society, the more devastating the impact would be when gravity finally pulled them back down to Earth. I opened my laptop and prepared to check my personal messages. It was time to see what the rest of the family was saying. I clicked open the messaging application on my laptop. The family group chat was pinned right at the top of my screen. They called the chat the Empire Builders. It was a ridiculously pretentious name that Marcus had chosen 2 years ago when his startup first received a tiny seed investment. I was honestly surprised they had not removed my number from the group yet. Usually when a couple gets divorced, the ex-wife is immediately kicked out of the digital family circle. But as I scrolled through the dozens of unread messages, I quickly realized they had left me in there on purpose. They wanted a front row seat to my humiliation. They wanted to make sure I saw every single detail of the new life Marcus was building without me. Keisha was the first one to start the digital ambush. Keisha was Marcus's younger sister. At 30 years old, she had never held a real job for more than 6 months at a time. She survived entirely on the monthly allowance her mother gave her and the money she siphoned from her husband Brad. Keisha had flooded the chat with screenshots of Chloe's livestream and high-resolution pictures of expensive floral arrangements. She tagged my phone number directly in the chat so I would get a loud notification. "Are you taking notes, Naomi?" she wrote. "This is what a real luxury event looks like. Too bad you will be spending your entire weekend packing your cheap office clothes into cardboard boxes." Then her husband Brad chimed in to deliver his own crushing blow. Brad was 34 years old and worked as a mid-level financial broker at a firm downtown. He was a wealthy white man who had married into the family and immediately appointed himself as the ultimate authority on all things related to money and success. He wore pastel polo shirts and constantly talked loudly about venture capital and aggressive investment strategies, as if he had personally invented the concepts himself. Brad had always deeply resented me. He hated the fact that I was a self-sufficient black woman who held a significantly higher title in the financial sector than he did. At family dinners, he would constantly try to explain very basic economic principles to me, just to hear his own voice. I usually just nodded and let him talk, but my silence only made him more desperate to prove his superiority. Now that Marcus had officially discarded me, Brad felt completely emboldened to put me in my place. He sent a massive paragraph to the group chat. "Wake up, Naomi," he typed. "Marcus is not paying you a single dime. You need to face reality and sell that crumbling house of yours to pay off your massive debts. Stop waiting around for a handout from my brother-in-law. The tech train is leaving the station and you are not holding a ticket. Take whatever pennies you have left and go hide in the suburbs." I watched the screen as Shirley responded to Brad's vicious message with a row of clapping hands emojis. Marcus did not say anything in the chat, but I could clearly see his red receipt directly under the message. He was watching the conversation in real time and silently approving of his family tearing me apart. They were hunting together as a pack. They felt completely invincible because Marcus had just secured a verbal commitment for $50 million from a major venture capital firm. They truly believed that imaginary future money made them untouchable gods among regular people. I read Brad's condescending message 3 times. The pure, unadulterated smugness radiating from his text was almost comical to me. Brad thought he was a financial apex predator, but he was actually the biggest blind fool in the entire family. What Keisha and Shirley did not understand was that Brad was an incredibly desperate man. His mid-level brokerage job barely covered the massive credit card bills that Keisha racked up every single month. He was completely obsessed with the idea of getting rich quickly without doing any actual hard work. For the past 6 months, Brad had been relentlessly begging Marcus to let him invest his own money into the startup. He wanted to get in on the ground floor before the massive venture capital funding round officially closed. He wanted to ride my former husband's coattails straight to the very top of the Forbes list. I knew for a fact that Brad had recently gained full access to his family trust fund. It was a very substantial amount of money that his grandfather had left him. Brad was exactly the kind of arrogant finance bro who would risk everything on a flashy tech application without ever conducting a proper due diligence check. He was lecturing me about my massive debts while simultaneously preparing to gamble his entire inheritance on a company he knew nothing about. I did not type a single word in response to the group chat. Engaging with them in a petty text message argument was a complete waste of my highly valuable energy. I did not need to defend my honor or my bank account to people who were willingly marching off a massive financial cliff. Brad was telling me to wake up and pay my debts. He had absolutely no idea that my debts were actually strategically calculated leverage. He had no idea that the old crumbling house he was mocking was sitting on a massive piece of commercial real estate that I had spent the last 2 years quietly rezoning for industrial use. Let them laugh, I thought to myself as I watched 3 more typing bubbles appear on the screen. The group chat was their safe space to project all of their own deep insecurities directly onto me. Keisha hated me because I refused to give her personal loans when she overspent her budget. Shirley hated me because I refused to worship her son like a flawless deity. And Brad hated me because I never once asked for his mediocre financial advice. They were all bonding over my supposed destruction. I minimized the messaging window and let the digital notifications pile up silently in the background. The constant buzzing of my phone was just meaningless white noise at this point. Brad thought he was securing his luxurious future by aligning himself with Marcus and Chloe. He thought he was backing the winning horse. It took an incredible amount of professional self-control not to text back and ask him if he had personally reviewed the intellectual property assignments for the tech startup. Any real financial broker with half a brain would demand to see the software licensing agreements before investing a single dollar of their trust fund. But Brad was completely blinded by greed and his own massive ego. He was trusting Marcus completely, and Marcus was trusting a worthless piece of paper he had practically forced his ex-wife to sign under extreme duress. The level of collective stupidity operating in that group chat was truly a masterpiece of human arrogance. I took a deep breath and opened my encrypted work email. The family had had their fun. It was finally time for me to get back to business. I pushed the silver laptop slightly away from the center of my desk and let the digital noise of my former family fade into absolute silence. The camera would stay tightly focused on my face and the polished mahogany surface of my desk, deliberately hiding the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. I did not want the audience or anyone else to see the panoramic view of the downtown Atlanta skyline that my corner office commanded. I wanted to keep the illusion of the struggling consultant alive for just a few more days. The truth was that while Brad was gambling his grandfather's trust fund on a highly speculative startup, I was actively managing a financial portfolio worth over $3 billion. I handled asset protection and risk management for international shipping magnates, legacy real estate families, and anonymous corporate titans. My daily reality involved moving mountains of capital across global markets with a single phone call. The family group chat was nothing more than a minor distraction. It was a tiny ant farm that I occasionally glanced at for pure entertainment. I opened a highly secure encrypted folder on my desktop and began reviewing the quarterly projections for a private equity client. I worked with the kind of intense focus that Marcus always claimed was boring and uninspired. He wanted a wife who would smile brightly on red carpets and eagerly organize high society charity galas to boost his public profile. He never understood that true power does not actively seek the spotlight. True power operates silently in the shadows. It sits quietly in a heavy leather chair, reviewing ironclad legal contracts, while the absolute fools dance blindly in the bright flash of the paparazzi cameras. Marcus and Chloe were currently spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on imported white orchids, celebrity chefs, and designer wedding outfits for an event that was fundamentally built on a massive financial lie. They genuinely thought the $50 million venture capital injection was a guaranteed lock. They had already mentally spent the money to elevate their lifestyle. But Tier 1 venture capital firms do not just hand over a $50 million check because a founder has a charismatic smile and a pretty new influencer wife. They require rigorous legal due diligence. They require concrete, unassailable proof of intellectual property ownership. A soft double knock on my heavy oak office door pulled my attention away from the international market projections. The door clicked open, and my executive assistant stepped into the room. Her name was Maya. She was a brilliant 28-year-old black woman with dual degrees in corporate law and advanced financial theory. She did not walk with the frantic, scattered energy of someone dealing with an unexpected corporate emergency. She moved with the calm, calculated precision of a professional who knew exactly how much destructive power she held in her hands. Maya walked straight to my desk and carefully placed a single thick manila folder perfectly in the center of my leather blotter. It was the exact same type of cheap folder Marcus had mockingly thrown at me in the law firm conference room just 1 week ago. But this one felt significantly heavier with consequence. "Boss," she said with a completely neutral expression that barely hid her underlying satisfaction, "the private courier just dropped this off directly from the downtown courthouse. The Superior Court judge signed the final decree at exactly 10 o'clock this morning. The court has officially finalized the divorce settlement without any amendments." Maya paused and tapped the heavy paper with her manicured fingernail, drawing my attention to the official seal. "The transfer of the intellectual property is now a permanent matter of public record. 100% of the software source code, the server access rights, the encrypted user databases, and the operational payment patents have been legally and permanently transferred to N&C Holdings. The clean break clause is fully activated and locked into place." I did not snatch the folder the way Marcus had violently snatched his copy at the law firm. I slowly reached out and opened the heavy paper cover. I let my eyes trace over the official blue ink of the judge's signature and the heavy raised seal of the Atlanta Superior Court. It was a beautiful, masterful piece of legal art. It was the ultimate receipt for 8 years of my quiet patience, my early financial backing, and my silent endurance of his massive ego. Marcus was now completely and legally severed from his own creation. He had built the shiny exterior of the vehicle, but he had just willingly handed me the keys, the engine block, and the title, while he sat smiling happily in the passenger seat. I looked up at Maya. Her strictly professional facade finally cracked just a fraction, revealing a sharp, knowing smile. She had been the one to personally draft the intellectual property transfer documents under my direct supervision years ago. She knew exactly what this piece of paper meant for the arrogant tech chief executive officer who used to treat her like a glorified waitress at our corporate holiday parties. "Does his aggressive legal team have any possible grounds for an appeal or a stay of execution?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Maya shook her head immediately. "Absolutely none, Naomi. They expedited the legal process entirely on their own to clear his schedule for the wedding and the venture capital closing. His own highly paid lawyers pushed the clean break clause through the court system without conducting a standard secondary asset review. They were so blinded by the $50 million funding deadline that they practically shoved the intellectual property directly into our secure vault and locked the door behind them. He explicitly waived the standard 30-day cooling-off period in writing. "The agreement is completely airtight. The application belongs to you." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and let the profound, heavy weight of the moment settle over the quiet, luxurious room. Marcus and Chloe were probably cutting their expensive multi-tiered wedding cake right at this very second. Brad was probably bragging loudly to the wealthy wedding guests about his massive $5 million insider investment. Shirley was undoubtedly shedding dramatic tears of joy over her brilliant self-made son and his perfect new bride. They were all standing confidently on a fragile glass floor that was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. I reached for the delicate porcelain cup resting on the polished edge of my desk. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter warmth wash away the last lingering traces of my former life. I set the cup down with a soft click against the mahogany wood. "Excellent," I said, looking directly into Maya's eyes. "Get ready to cut the breaker." While I sat quietly in my high-rise office signing the death warrant of his tech startup, Marcus was stepping out of a vintage Rolls-Royce at a rented historical mansion in Buckhead. The venue was an absolutely massive estate, with towering white columns and sprawling manicured gardens. It was the kind of property that screamed old money, but every single thing about this wedding was entirely rented for the afternoon. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were bleeding out of Marcus's accounts to maintain a perfect illusion of generational wealth. The decor was aggressively opulent. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded down the grand sweeping staircase. Massive crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon sun, throwing rainbows across the custom marble dance floor. A giant ice sculpture of their intertwined initials was slowly melting near an open bar that served $1,000 bottles of champagne. It was a beautifully orchestrated physical manifestation of Chloe's shallow social media feed. Chloe emerged from the bridal suite looking less like a blushing bride and more like a reality television star arriving at a reunion special. She wore a custom designer gown that was so heavily beaded it looked like it weighed 50 pounds. Instead of carrying a traditional floral bouquet in both hands, she held a small arrangement of rare lilies in one hand and her smartphone attached to a stabilizing gimbal in the other. She was actually live streaming her own wedding reception to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She shoved the camera lens directly into the faces of the wealthy venture capitalists and local tech celebrities Marcus had practically begged to attend. "Smile for the vlog, everyone!" Chloe squealed as she paraded through the outdoor cocktail hour. "We are celebrating absolute greatness today. Look at this amazing venue, guys. My king really treats me like royalty." But underneath the loud thumping bass of the string quartet playing modern pop songs and the continuous clinking of crystal champagne glasses, a very quiet current of gossip was flowing through the crowd. I had been a permanent fixture in Marcus's life for 8 years. Many of the early angel investors and tech executives in attendance had only written their initial checks to his startup because they deeply trusted my conservative risk management background. They were huddled in small, tight groups near the edges of the rose garden, whispering behind their hands. "It has only been exactly 7 days," one older prominent investor murmured to his wife while watching Chloe aggressively pose for a selfie. "Naomi built that boy from the absolute ground up. She managed his entire back office and kept him out of bankruptcy. Now she is just completely erased. It does not sit right with me." Another tech founder standing nearby shook his head slowly. He noted how incredibly unstable it looked for a chief executive officer to loudly divorce his wife and marry a young internet influencer just days before closing a massive Series B venture capital round. It showed a severe lack of personal judgment and a complete lack of impulse control. The whispers were starting to spread, threatening to ruin the perfect image Marcus was trying so desperately to project. But Marcus's family was well prepared to run defense. Shirley, Keisha, and Brad were actively patrolling the lavish reception like highly aggressive security guards, armed with trays of expensive caviar. Whenever Shirley heard my name mentioned, she immediately swooped in to aggressively change the narrative. She wore a completely over-the-top sequined dress that competed directly with the bride for attention. "Oh, we absolutely do not mention the past today." Shirley laughed loudly, violently, interrupting a group of skeptical older investors. "Marcus is finally free from all of that boring negative energy. You know exactly how it is when a true visionary genius is being held back by a small-minded woman. She just could not keep up with his massive success. He is finally stepping into his true destiny now." Brad was hovering near the open bar, cornering anyone who looked remotely important or wealthy. He was sweating slightly in his expensive pastel suit, but he spoke with the absolute unearned confidence of a man who thought he had just mathematically beaten the stock market. He loudly ordered top-shelf aged whiskey and made sure everyone around him heard him discussing his brilliant financial portfolio. "Naomi just did not have the stomach for high-level venture capital," Brad explained to a group of very bored-looking software developers. "She wanted to play it safe and keep things small. But Marcus and I deeply understand aggressive market growth. We are visionaries. I just personally injected $5 million into his Series B funding round. We are about to completely disrupt the entire global payment processing industry, and I got in on the ground floor." Keisha was busy treating the hired waitstaff like her own personal servants. She snapped her fingers loudly to demand fresh champagne and actively positioned herself in the background of all of Chloe's live videos. She wanted everyone online to see that she was part of the elite inner circle. The entire family was putting on a masterclass in aggressive financial posturing. Slowly but surely, the sheer massive volume of the wealth on display began to successfully drown out the whispering guests. When you throw enough expensive champagne, imported Wagyu beef, and gold leaf desserts at a crowd of wealthy socialites, they eventually stop asking uncomfortable questions. The skeptical investors looked around at the towering floral arrangements and the fleet of exotic luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. They did the mental math in their heads. No sane man would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a flashy wedding if his tech company was not absolutely bulletproof. The massive display of reckless spending acted as a perfect psychological smokescreen. It successfully convinced the doubting investors that the $50 million funding round was already a guaranteed reality. The whispers faded away, completely replaced by loud laughter and enthusiastic congratulations. The illusion was holding together perfectly. Marcus finally made his way to the center of the grand ballroom to prepare for his big speech. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He walked with a heavy swagger, his chest puffed out with total arrogance. He looked around the massive room at the hundreds of important people eating his expensive food and drinking his top-shelf liquor. He felt like an absolute king conquering his new empire. He had successfully erased me from his life without a single consequence. He had secured the beautiful young wife, the adoring loyal family, and the deep respect of his wealthy peers. He looked down at his heavy gold watch, completely unaware that miles away, the clock had already run out on his fake empire. He grabbed a microphone from the wedding planner and tapped it twice, calling for the attention of the entire room. He was ready to deliver the final crushing blow to my memory. He was ready to solidify his fake halo in front of the entire world. The high-pitched feedback of the microphone echoed briefly through the massive ballroom, instantly silencing the chatter of the wealthy guests. The string quartet stopped playing, and the heavy crystal chandeliers were dimmed to a soft, golden glow. A single bright spotlight tracked Marcus as he stood in the center of the custom marble dance floor. He held a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and the microphone in the other. He looked out over the sea of elite venture capitalists, socialites, and family members with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had conquered the universe. Chloe rushed to his side, strategically positioning herself so the camera crew she hired could capture her best angle. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are surrounded by the absolute best and brightest minds in Atlanta. I see incredible founders, brilliant investors, and the family members who have supported me through the hardest chapters of my life." He paused and looked down at Chloe, who was gazing up at him with wide, adoring eyes. He placed his hand over his heart, performing for the crowd. "But most importantly, I am standing next to my absolute queen. Chloe, you are the light that finally chased away the dark clouds of my past. You showed me what it means to be truly supported by a partner who understands the relentless drive of an entrepreneur." The crowd offered a soft collective sigh of admiration. Shirley dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief from the front row. But Marcus was not finished. He needed to make himself look like a martyr who had overcome massive adversity. He needed to publicly assassinate my character to justify his rapid divorce and immediate remarriage. For a very long time, I was not living up to my true potential. Marcus continued, his tone shifting from romantic to deeply serious. I was trapped in a situation that was completely draining my ambition. I was chained to a life of extreme limitations. When you are building a massive tech empire, you need to surround yourself with people who tell you to fly. But my previous marriage was a heavy anchor holding back my greatness. I was tied to a woman who was obsessed with playing it safe. A woman who looked at my visionary ideas and only saw budget constraints and risk factors. She wanted me to remain a small, quiet man so she could feel comfortable in her small, quiet world. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. The tech executives nodded in serious agreement. In the highly toxic culture of startup founders, abandoning a supportive partner who helped build the foundation was often reframed as a necessary step for personal growth. Marcus was playing their exact tune. He was painting me as a bitter, uninspired obstacle who had tried to crush his dreams out of pure jealousy. "It takes a massive amount of courage to cut the cord on dead weight," Marcus said, his voice rising with intense theatrical passion. "It takes immense bravery to walk away from people who demand you shrink yourself to fit into their tiny boxes. But I refuse to shrink. I chose to break the anchor. I chose to demand absolute greatness, and I chose to cut every single tie to the mediocrity of my past." Chloe leaned her head against his shoulder and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. Keisha clapped her hands loudly from the second row, shouting her complete agreement. Brad raised his whiskey glass high in the air, nodding vigorously. "And because I had the courage to cut that dead weight," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "I am standing here today as a completely liberated man. But I am not just celebrating my beautiful new bride today. I am celebrating the ultimate validation of my life's work." The room suddenly grew incredibly quiet. Every single wealthy investor and tech journalist in the crowd leaned forward. They could smell the money. They knew a major financial announcement was coming, and in their world, money was the only metric that actually mattered. "For the past 6 months, I have been in highly confidential talks with one of the most exclusive shadow venture capital firms in the entire country," Marcus announced, pacing slowly across the dance floor. "They are notoriously strict. They demand absolute perfection. They demand a flawlessly clean legal slate and a completely unencumbered corporate structure. They wanted to make absolutely sure that no bitter ghosts from my past could ever touch the empire I built." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build in the massive room. He looked directly at the camera Chloe had set up on a tripod, making sure his victory was permanently recorded for the entire internet to see. "I am incredibly proud to officially announce that at exactly midnight last night, our legal team finalized the absolute clean break required for our funding," Marcus yelled, raising his champagne glass high above his head. "And this morning, that shadow venture fund officially committed to a massive $50 million Series B injection into my payment application. We are officially a $50 million company." The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. It was an explosion of deafening cheers, applause, and wild screaming. The string quartet immediately launched into a fast, triumphant song. The wealthy venture capitalists jumped to their feet, clapping furiously. A $50 million commitment was a massive, astronomical win. It meant the startup was on a direct path to a billion-dollar valuation. Chloe broke down into loud, performative tears of joy. She threw her arms around Marcus's neck, sobbing directly into his tuxedo jacket, while making sure her massive diamond ring was perfectly visible to the cameras. Shirley rushed onto the dance floor, completely ignoring wedding etiquette, to grab her son and squeeze him tightly. She was crying hysterically, screaming that her boy was a verified genius. Brad was acting like he had just won the lottery. He was aggressively high-fiving the tech developers and shouting at the top of his lungs. "50 million," he screamed over the loud music. "I told you all. I am in for 5 million. We are going to the absolute moon." The waiters immediately began circulating with fresh bottles of the most expensive champagne in the building. The celebration transformed into a wild, frantic frenzy of extreme greed. Every single person in the room wanted to touch Marcus. They wanted to shake his hand, congratulate him, and desperately try to get a piece of his massive new fortune. He was surrounded by a thick wall of adoring fans and wealthy sycophants. He stood in the center of the chaos, drinking his champagne and soaking in the absolute worship of his peers. He had done it. He had publicly humiliated the woman who funded his entire journey. He had secured a beautiful young trophy wife. He had legally severed all ties with his past, and he had just secured a $50 million bag of venture capital cash. He was completely on top of the world. He was an unstoppable financial god. But as Marcus smiled for the flashing cameras and accepted the endless handshakes from the elite investors, he was completely oblivious to the fatal flaw in his brilliant master plan. The Shadow Venture Fund had indeed demanded a perfectly clean cap table. They had demanded that his intellectual property be completely unencumbered by any previous marital claims. Marcus thought his aggressive clean break divorce agreement had satisfied those strict requirements perfectly. He thought forcing me to take N and C holdings had protected his software. He had no idea that the venture capital firm had not yet conducted their final secondary technical audit. They had committed the $50 million based entirely on his sworn legal statements that he owned the source code. They were scheduled to ping the main servers tomorrow morning to finalize the transfer of the funds. Marcus was currently celebrating the sale of a massive mansion, but he had just legally handed the deed, the locks, and the entire foundation to the woman he was publicly calling an anchor. The loud cheers echoing through the rented ballroom were nothing more than the final joyful sounds of a massive financial Titanic steaming directly toward a hidden iceberg. And I was sitting quietly in my office, with my hand resting firmly on the controls of that exact iceberg, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The applause following Marcus's announcement was completely deafening. The rented ballroom felt less like a wedding reception and more like a chaotic stock exchange trading floor. Waiters scrambled to open more champagne, while wealthy investors crowded around the dance floor trying to get a moment of Marcus's time. But the person who pushed his way to the front of the crowd the fastest was Brad. His face was flushed red from top-shelf whiskey and absolute greed. He could not stand the fact that Marcus was getting all the attention. Brad needed everyone in the room to know that he was also a financial genius. He needed to prove that he belonged in this elite circle of multimillionaires. Brad snatched the microphone right out of Marcus's hand. He stumbled slightly, but quickly caught his balance, smoothing down his expensive pastel suit jacket. "Listen up, everyone," Brad shouted into the microphone. His voice was slurred but dripping with extreme arrogance. "Marcus is a visionary, but it takes a real financial expert to spot a unicorn before it takes flight. I am a broker. I analyze markets for a living. And when I looked at my brother-in-law's tech company, I did not see a risky startup. I saw the future of global finance." The crowd quieted down slightly, watching the sweaty white finance broker claim his piece of the glory. Keisha was standing near the front row, cheering wildly for her husband. She had a massive smile on her face, completely convinced that she was about to become the wealthiest woman in Atlanta. A lot of people doubted Marcus. Brad continued pacing across the dance floor. A lot of small-minded people, including some who used to be part of this very family, thought he was dreaming too big. But I put my money exactly where my mouth is. Last week, I completely liquidated my grandfather's trust fund. I cashed out every single conservative portfolio I owned. I even took out a massive second mortgage on my own home to scrape together the capital. I dumped exactly $5 million into this Series B funding round. A loud murmur rippled through the crowd. Liquidating a trust fund and mortgaging a home to invest in a single early-stage tech startup was an incredibly reckless financial move. It went against every single rule of basic wealth management. But in that room, fueled by the news of the $50 million commitment, Brad did not look like a fool to them. He looked like a bold, aggressive gambler who was about to win the absolute jackpot. "When this company goes public next year, that $5 million is going to turn into $50 million. Brad screamed, throwing his free hand into the air. "We are keeping the wealth right here in the family. We are building a dynasty." Keisha ran onto the dance floor and threw her arms around Brad. The crowd cheered again, caught up in the infectious wave of extreme greed. Brad handed the microphone back to Marcus, looking incredibly smug. He had just publicly chained his entire financial existence to his brother-in-law. He had bet his house, his inheritance, and his marriage on a tech application that he had never even properly audited. But the absolute height of the family delusion was still yet to come. Shirley stepped out from the crowd and walked slowly toward her son. She wiped dramatic tears from her eyes with her lace handkerchief. She motioned for Marcus to lower the microphone so she could speak directly into it. The room fell completely silent. They were ready for a touching moment between a successful founder and his devoted mother. When Marcus was a little boy, he used to take apart the television just to see how it worked. Shirley began, her voice trembling with intense emotion. "I always knew he was brilliant. I always knew he was destined to change the world. But building an empire takes real sacrifice. It takes absolute unwavering loyalty. It takes a family that believes in you when the rest of the world turns their back." She looked directly into the camera lens that Chloe was holding. She wanted this next statement to be permanently recorded. She wanted to make sure I saw it wherever I was hiding. When Marcus told me he was finally breaking free from his toxic past and needed a clean slate, I did not hesitate for a single second, Shirley cried. A mother knows a true genius when she sees one. So last month I went to the bank. I took out a second mortgage on the family home, the house we have owned for 30 years. I took every single penny of equity I had left and I gave it to my son. I backed my boy because I know he is going to buy me a mansion 10 times the size of that old house. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of sympathetic ahs and loud applause. Marcus looked genuinely moved. He wrapped his arms tightly around his mother and hugged her in front of the flashing cameras. It was a picture-perfect moment of family loyalty and triumph. Shirley had risked her entire secure retirement to back her golden child. She had literally bet the roof over her head on his supposed tech genius. Marcus grabbed the microphone one last time. He looked around the room, his chest puffed out with total pride. He had his wealthy investors. He had his loyal family who had literally given him their last dimes. And he had his beautiful young bride. He turned to Chloe and pulled a small velvet box from his tuxedo pocket. To celebrate our new empire and our $50 million future. I have one more surprise, Marcus announced. He opened the box to reveal a massive diamond wedding band designed to perfectly match her engagement ring. Chloe gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. The crowd completely melted. It was the absolute climax of their perfect fake reality. Marcus took the massive diamond ring out of the velvet box. He reached for Chloe's left hand, ready to slide the ultimate symbol of their wealth onto her finger. The string quartet began playing a slow romantic melody. The cameras flashed blindingly bright, capturing the perfect fairy tale ending. At that exact same second, miles away in the absolute silence of my high-rise office, my executive assistant Maya stood perfectly still beside my desk. The heavy oak door was closed, blocking out the rest of the world. The only light in the room came from the glowing screen of my secure laptop. Maya had opened the master control terminal for N&C Holdings. The black screen displayed lines of green text connecting directly to the central servers that hosted the entire payment application. The clean break agreement was fully executed. The intellectual property transfer was absolute and permanently recorded by the Superior Court. I owned the code. I owned the servers. I owned the entire digital foundation of the company they were currently celebrating. Are you absolutely certain you want to initiate the complete shutdown protocol right now? Maya asked, her voice quiet, but filled with intense anticipation. Once we revoke the server access, the entire application will go completely dark. Every single payment gateway will instantly fail. The venture capital firm will get a fatal error message when they try to ping the system tomorrow morning. I looked away from the glowing screen and stared out the massive windows at the dark city skyline. I thought about the 8 years I spent building his foundation. I thought about the brutal way he threw the divorce papers at me. I thought about Shirley calling me a lucky leech and Brad telling me to sell my crumbling house. They had all pushed all of their chips to the absolute center of the table. They were drunk on their own arrogance and completely blinded by their own greed. They had dug their own graves and jumped inside with bright smiles on their faces. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on my leather desk blotter. Maya handed me the final authorization directive required to execute the massive digital shutdown. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt the absolute cold clarity of a woman taking back exactly what belonged to her. Marcus held Chloe's hand in the crowded ballroom. He smiled brightly for the cameras as he slowly pushed the heavy diamond ring over her knuckle. In my quiet office, I pressed my pen to the thick paper. I signed my name with a sharp, decisive stroke. Execute the directive, I told Maya, my voice like ice. Revoke the server access. Cut the cord. Maya hit the enter key on the secure laptop. The green text on the screen flashed red. Access denied. The execution was complete. The ultimate trap had finally snapped shut. The morning sun broke through the massive glass windows of the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the ultra-exclusive first-class lounge. It was exactly 10 hours since I signed the shutdown directive in my office. Marcus was sitting in a plush leather armchair, wearing a designer travel suit, and sipping a freshly brewed espresso. He looked exhausted from the wild wedding celebration, but his face still held the smug, satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire financial world. They were waiting to board a direct first-class flight to the Maldives for a 3-week honeymoon that was costing more than most people earned in 5 years. Chloe was standing near the gourmet breakfast buffet holding her smartphone on its stabilizing stick. She was already filming her 4th vlog of the morning. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors and a matching silk travel set that she had made sure to tag with the brand name in her live feed. She was twirling around, pointing the camera at the expensive pastries and the private champagne bar provided exclusively for the elite travelers. "Good morning to all my beautiful followers," Chloe chirped into the camera, flashing her massive new diamond ring every chance she got. "We are officially husband and wife, and we are currently relaxing in the private first-class lounge before we jet off to our private villa in the Maldives. My king is resting his brilliant brain because he literally just secured $50 million for our empire last night. I am so incredibly blessed to be living this perfect life with the smartest man on the planet." Marcus watched her perform for the internet and smiled proudly. He took another sip of his espresso and leaned back into the soft leather. He loved the attention. He loved that hundreds of thousands of strangers were currently watching his beautiful young wife brag about his massive wealth. He felt completely untouchable. He had successfully discarded his boring past and stepped into a glittering new reality. Then his smartphone vibrated against the glass tabletop. It was a short, sharp buzz. Marcus ignored it, assuming it was just another congratulatory text message from one of the wealthy investors who had attended the wedding reception. He wanted to finish his espresso and bask in the glory of his victory. But 3 seconds later, the phone vibrated again. Then it vibrated 3 times in rapid succession. Then the screen lit up completely, and the device began shaking violently on the table with a continuous stream of incoming calls and high-priority text messages. Chloe spun around, still pointing the camera in his direction. "Honey, your phone is absolutely blowing up," she laughed playfully. "Everyone wants a piece of the tech genius today. Tell them they have to wait 3 weeks. You belong exclusively to me right now." Marcus offered a strained chuckle for the live broadcast, but a tiny knot of irritation began to form in his stomach. He hated being bothered with minor operational issues when he was off the clock. He was the chief executive officer. He paid his technical team very generous salaries to handle the daily maintenance of the payment application. He reached across the table and picked up the vibrating device, expecting to send a quick, angry text, telling his staff to handle whatever minor server glitch had woken them up on a Sunday morning. But when he unlocked the screen, the blood instantly drained from his face. His notification center was completely overwhelmed. There were 42 missed calls from his chief technology officer. There were 27 urgent text messages from his lead software engineers. There were automated system alerts from their primary hosting provider flooding his inbox with critical warning tags in bright red text. Marcus felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He quickly swiped away the notifications and navigated to his home screen. He wanted to open the payment application himself to see exactly what the users were experiencing. He moved his thumb to tap the familiar blue and white logo that he had proudly displayed to the venture capital firm just a few days ago, but the logo was not there. Instead of the vibrant, colorful icon he was used to seeing, the application square was completely grayed out. It looked like a dead link. It looked like an application that had been forcibly removed from the operating system. Marcus tapped the grayed-out icon with a frantic, heavy push of his thumb. The screen briefly flashed black, and a small white loading circle spun for exactly 2 seconds before a cold, sterile system message popped up on his screen. The message read, "Application unavailable. Connection to host server has been permanently severed. Please contact the administrator." His breathing suddenly became very shallow. He tapped the icon again. He tapped it 3 more times, his thumb hitting the glass screen with increasing aggressive force. The exact same sterile error message popped up every single time. Application unavailable. Connection to host server has been permanently severed. This was not a minor coding bug. This was not a routine server maintenance issue. A grayed-out application meant the core code was completely inaccessible. It meant the entire digital infrastructure that processed millions of dollars in transactions had just vanished into thin air. Marcus quickly opened his mobile web browser and navigated to the administrative backend of his company. He typed in his highly secure credentials and hit enter. He expected to see the familiar dashboard displaying user activity and real-time revenue tracking. Instead, he was met with a blank white screen and a bold error code that made his stomach drop completely. Error 403. Access strictly forbidden. Unauthorized user. Unauthorized user. Marcus stared at those two words, feeling the room start to spin. He was the founder. He was the chief executive officer. He was the man who had just stood in a ballroom and claimed he was building a $50 million empire. How could he possibly be an unauthorized user on his own digital platform? Chloe walked over to the table and sat down next to him, entirely oblivious to the massive financial heart attack happening right in front of her. She leaned her head on his shoulder and pointed her camera at both of their faces. "Tell the vlog how excited you are to swim with the sea turtles, babe," she squealed, pressing her cheek against his. Marcus forced his facial muscles to form a rigid, unnatural smile. He stared blankly into the camera lens while his heart pounded violently against his rib cage. "I am very excited," he managed to choke out, his voice sounding incredibly hollow and thin. Chloe giggled and kissed his cheek before turning the camera back to herself. "He is just tired from being so incredibly successful," she told her followers. Marcus quickly locked his phone and shoved it deep into the pocket of his travel suit. He needed to get away from the camera. He needed to get away from the loud music playing in the lounge and the smell of the expensive pastries. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. "I need to use the restroom," he muttered, avoiding Chloe's confused gaze. "I will be right back." He did not wait for her response. He practically sprinted across the first-class lounge, pushing past a waiter carrying a tray of mimosa glasses. He slammed the heavy wooden door of the private restroom shut behind him and locked it tight. He pulled his phone back out with trembling hands. The screen was still lighting up with frantic notifications. The knot in his stomach had completely exploded into absolute blinding panic. He dialed the number for his chief technology officer. The phone did not even ring once before it was frantically answered. Kevin answered the call before the first ring even had a chance to finish. He did not say hello. He did not ask how the wedding went, or wish his boss a happy honeymoon. The chief technology officer just started screaming frantically into the receiver. "The application is completely down, Marcus." Kevin's voice was cracking with absolute, unadulterated terror. "And I do not mean we have a slow server or a minor routing bug. I mean we are experiencing a catastrophic total system failure. Every single payment gateway across the entire global network is locked tight. The application programming interface is completely dead. Our merchant portals are rejecting every single transaction. We are showing a level 1 intellectual property violation across every server we operate." Marcus stood perfectly still. He stared at himself in the expensive gold-framed mirror of the first-class lounge restroom. He watched the healthy, glowing color completely drain from his own face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "What the hell are you talking about, Kevin?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice down so the wealthy travelers walking past the door would not hear him. "We do not have intellectual property violations. I wrote every single line of that core code myself in my garage. Fix it right now. Spin up the backup servers and get the platform back online before the venture capital firm wakes up and tries to run their final system audit." "You are not listening to me, Marcus," Kevin shouted. The audio quality was slightly distorted because Kevin was practically hyperventilating on the other end of the line. "The backup servers are gone. The cloud hosting provider completely severed our enterprise account 10 minutes ago. They did not just temporarily pause our services. They completely revoked our administrative access. We are permanently locked out of our own digital house." Marcus gripped the edge of the cold marble sink so hard his knuckles turned completely white. A thick, cold sweat broke out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. "That is technically impossible," he growled, his voice vibrating with intense, blinding rage. "I am the founder of this company. I am the chief executive officer. I hold the master administrative keys. Call the cloud provider right now and tell them there is a massive technical glitch. Tell them I will personally sue their entire organization into absolute bankruptcy if they do not restore my platform in the next 60 seconds. Kevin let out a sound that was halfway between a desperate sob and a hysterical laugh. "It is not a technical glitch, Marcus. The cloud provider did not make a mistake. They received a verified direct override command from the master control terminal. Someone with a higher security clearance than you went in and initiated a complete systemic shutdown. They wiped our access credentials and triggered a catastrophic intellectual property lock." Marcus felt the heavy marble walls of the luxurious restroom slowly closing in on him. The air suddenly felt incredibly thin. He was struggling to pull enough oxygen into his lungs. "There is no higher security clearance than mine," he screamed completely, forgetting to keep his voice down. "I built this entire company from absolutely nothing. I am the sole owner of the source code. No one else on the planet has the legal authority to trigger an intellectual property lock on my software. You are the Chief Technology Officer, Kevin. Do your damn job and hack back into the mainframe right now." "I cannot hack into a system that legally does not belong to us anymore," Kevin cried desperately. The automated cease and desist order came directly from the legal department of our hosting provider. They flagged our entire operation as a massive copyright infringement. Every single merchant who relies on our payment processing is currently watching their daily transactions fail. Millions of dollars in user funds are completely frozen in digital limbo. Social media is already exploding. Our users think we just pulled a massive financial exit scam. The tech blogs are already writing the articles, Marcus. Our customer service lines are completely jammed and the automated refund systems are failing because our bank accounts are frozen. We are in the middle of a total meltdown." Marcus stared at his own terrified reflection. The perfectly tailored travel suit suddenly felt like a heavy straitjacket pulling tight across his chest. The $50 million venture capital deal required the application to maintain a flawless uptime record. The shadow fund investors were notoriously strict about technical stability. They had a real-time monitoring dashboard tracking the app performance. If the platform remained dark for even 1 hour, the massive deal would be completely dead. The elite investors would pull their term sheets and walk away without a second thought. And worse than that, Marcus had just accepted $5 million from his brother-in-law, Brad. If the company collapsed today, Brad would lose his entire inheritance and Shirley would lose her home. "Listen to me very carefully, Kevin," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. "I do not care what the automated error messages say. I do not care about the tech blogs or the angry users right now. I need you to bypass the primary cloud servers. Route the entire system through our emergency offshore backups. Just get the blue logo back on the screen. Give me the illusion of functionality until I can call the hosting provider and threaten their legal team into submission." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the phone. The only sound Marcus could hear was Kevin taking rapid, panicked breaths. "I already tried that, Marcus," Kevin finally whispered. "I tried to initialize the emergency offshore backups the exact second the primary servers went down. But the override command was absolute. It did not just target our cloud hosting. It targeted the foundational licensing structure of the software itself. The command was executed with flawless precision. Whoever did this knew our internal architecture better than I do. They knew exactly which digital arteries to cut to make the entire body bleed out instantly." Suddenly, a sharp, loud knock on the heavy wooden restroom door made Marcus jump out of his skin. "Honey, are you okay in there?" Chloe called out, her voice muffled by the thick wood. "The boarding announcement for our flight to the Maldives just started. We need to go to the gate right now so I can film us getting on the plane for my followers." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut tight. The sound of his new wife excitedly planning her social media content made him feel physically sick to his stomach. "Just give me 1 minute," he yelled back, his voice cracking slightly. He brought the phone back to his ear. His entire body was shaking uncontrollably with a toxic mixture of absolute fury and creeping, dreadful realization. "Kevin," he said slowly, pronouncing every single syllable with deadly precision. "Read me the exact text of the intellectual property violation notice. Read me the exact name of the entity claiming ownership of my source code." "I am looking at the legal notice right now," Kevin said, his voice shaking violently. The cloud provider attached a digital copy of an expedited court order. It was signed by a superior court judge yesterday morning. It explicitly states that our public-facing startup no longer holds a valid licensing agreement to utilize the core software. "Who owns it?" Marcus demanded, screaming so loudly his throat burned. "Who the hell is claiming they own my software?" There was another terrible, heavy pause. Kevin swallowed hard before speaking. "The master control terminal belongs to a limited liability company, Marcus. The execution directive was digitally signed by an authorized representative of an entity called N&C Holdings." The name hit Marcus like a massive physical blow to the chest. N&C Holdings, the completely worthless shell company he had thrown at his ex-wife in the law firm conference room, the garbage entity he had used to forcefully secure a clean break. The memories came flooding back to him with brutal, terrifying clarity. He remembered Naomi sitting quietly at the mahogany table. He remembered the calm, bright smile on her face as she signed the papers with her expensive pen. He remembered mocking her and telling her to enjoy managing a ghost company. He had never bothered to read the foundational licensing agreements when he started the company years ago. He had just eagerly signed whatever complex paperwork Naomi had put in front of him because he was too busy networking and pretending to be a visionary genius. He had completely forgotten that Naomi used her own pristine credit score and her own money to establish the intellectual property trust to protect him from his own bad financial habits. "Marcus," Kevin pleaded, his voice breaking into a quiet sob. "Who is N&C Holdings? What do we do? We are bleeding millions of dollars every single minute. The venture capital firm is going to call any second. Marcus, please tell me you know how to fix this." But Marcus could not speak. The expensive smartphone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm. He stood completely frozen in the luxurious airport restroom, staring at his own pale, terrified reflection. The massive $50 million empire was completely gone. The lavish wedding of the century was funded by stolen money. He had committed massive securities fraud by pledging intellectual property he did not legally own. And the quiet, boring consultant he had publicly humiliated was currently holding his entire life in the palm of her hand. A sudden sharp beep interrupted the heavy silence on the line. Another caller was merging into the secure conference call. It was David, the head of the corporate legal department for the startup. David did not sound frantic like Kevin. He sounded completely hollow and defeated, like a man who had just watched his entire career evaporate into thin air. "Marcus, tell me you are listening to me," David said, his voice flat and devoid of any professional courtesy. "I just got off a highly aggressive phone call with a team of corporate litigators representing N&C Holdings. The source code and the servers are not registered under our company, Marcus. They belong exclusively to them. And their lawyers just issued a massive federally binding cease and desist order against us." Marcus could barely hold the phone against his ear. His hand was shaking so violently that the device kept slipping against his sweaty skin. "David, you drafted my divorce settlement." Marcus choked out his voice, desperate and pleading. "You are the one who pushed the clean break clause through the court. You told me it would protect my assets from her. You told me the company was completely safe. I drafted exactly what you aggressively ordered me to draft." David snapped back suddenly, losing his professional composure. "You told me N&C Holdings was a meaningless shell company that she forced you to open years ago. You told me it had absolutely zero value. You explicitly demanded that we expedite the paperwork to get her off your back before the wedding. You signed a binding legal document waiving all current and future rights to anything owned by that entity." Marcus stared at the bathroom tiles. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears like a heavy drum. It turns out that Shell Company holds the absolute master licenses for every single piece of intellectual property we use. David continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. Your ex-wife did not just take a worthless company, Marcus. She took the entire digital infrastructure. You legally signed away the engine of your own car and then threw a massive party to celebrate. The cease and desist order is ironclad. If we even attempt to spin up a single server to process a payment, we will be instantly slapped with a massive federal lawsuit for intellectual property theft. We do not own the app, Marcus. We own absolutely nothing. But I am the founder! Marcus screamed, hitting his fist against the marble sink. The sharp pain shot up his arm, but it was nothing compared to the crushing agony in his chest. I wrote the original code. I built the brand. She cannot just steal my entire life's work on a technicality. Take her to court, David. File an emergency injunction. Tell the judge she manipulated the paperwork. There is no manipulation to claim, Marcus, David replied coldly. You were the one who pushed for the expedited divorce. You were the one who demanded the clean break. You signed it of your own free will in front of multiple witnesses. A judge will look at this and laugh us right out of the courtroom. Naomi executed a perfectly legal corporate checkmate. We are completely dead in the water. Before Marcus could scream another desperate command at his legal director, a loud chime echoed from his phone. It was a high-priority text message alert. The sound was usually reserved for banking alerts and emergency server notifications. He pulled the phone away from his ear and looked at the glowing screen. The message was from the managing partner of the Shadow Venture Capital Fund, the same billionaire investor who had shaken Marcus's hand and promised him $50 million just 12 hours ago. Marcus read the text message. The words blurred together at first, but the brutal reality quickly snapped into focus. Marcus, we have been notified of a catastrophic Level 1 intellectual property dispute regarding your core software. Our automated risk management systems flagged the federal cease and desist order filed against your company this morning. Per the strict terms of our preliminary agreement, any unresolved legal encumbrances result in an immediate termination of our offer. We are officially withdrawing our Series B commitment of $50 million, effective immediately. Do not contact this firm again. The glowing screen of the smartphone slowly dimmed and faded to black. The phone slipped completely out of his sweaty hand and crashed loudly onto the hard tile floor. The screen cracked, shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged lines. Marcus could still hear Kevin and David shouting his name through the cracked speaker on the floor, but their voices sounded like they were coming from a million miles away. His legs suddenly lost all of their strength. His knees buckled beneath him, and he dropped heavily to the floor of the luxurious airport restroom. He fell to his knees, landing right next to the shattered phone. He could not breathe. He could not form a single rational thought. The massive financial empire he had built his entire identity around was completely gone. The $50 million he had promised to his wealthy guests was gone. The app that was supposed to change the world was gone. And then the absolute worst realization of all hit him like a runaway freight train. He thought about his brother-in-law, Brad. Brad had aggressively liquidated a $5 million trust fund and taken out a second mortgage just to invest in this company. He thought about his mother, Shirley. She had mortgaged the only home she had ever owned to back his supposed tech genius. He had gladly taken their money to fuel his massive ego. They had all invested their entire life savings into a company that was literally worth $0. They had bought shares in a completely empty digital box. Marcus had not just destroyed his own life. He had completely bankrupted his entire family. A sharp, loud knock echoed through the restroom door again. Chloe was standing right outside. "Babe, they are doing the final boarding call for our first-class flight," she yelled, her voice full of cheerful excitement. "The camera is rolling. Come out here so we can show everyone how billionaires travel." Billionaires. Marcus let out a sound that was a sickening mixture of a laugh and a desperate choking sob. He was kneeling on the floor of a public restroom, completely broke, facing massive federal lawsuits and owing millions of dollars to furious investors. He had literally thrown away the brilliant, loyal woman who had protected him, and he had traded her for a girl who only cared about the camera. He covered his face with his trembling hands and finally let the absolute crushing weight of his arrogance destroy him. Marcus, if you are going to take all day in there, I am going to the designer boutique across the hall, Chloe shouted through the thick wooden door of the restroom. I'm not going to just stand out here waiting for you like some ordinary passenger. I need content for the vlog, and my followers want to see me shop. She did not wait for his response. She spun around on her expensive heels and marched directly into the high-end duty-free luxury store, located just steps away from the first-class lounge. She held her camera high, making sure the bright fluorescent lighting of the boutique caught the dazzling sparkle of her new massive diamond ring. She strutted past the glass display cases, pointing out imported silk scarves and expensive perfumes to her thousands of live viewers. I am thinking we need a new travel bag for the Maldives, guys, Chloe chirped happily into the lens. Something classic but aggressively expensive. A billionaire wife cannot be seen carrying last season's luggage on her honeymoon. She zeroed in on a rare limited edition leather handbag sitting on a velvet pedestal in the center of the store. The price tag attached to the handle clearly read $14,500. Chloe did not even blink. She scooped the heavy bag off the display and carried it confidently to the checkout counter. She placed her smartphone on the glass counter, perfectly angling the camera so her audience could watch her complete the massive purchase. The cashier was a sharply dressed woman who offered a polite customer service smile. She carefully wrapped the designer bag in tissue paper and placed it into a large branded shopping bag. That will be $14,500 plus tax, the cashier said, tapping the total into the sleek digital register. Chloe pulled Marcus's heavy metal black card from her wallet and handed it over with a deeply arrogant smirk. It was the exclusive corporate account card directly linked to the startup funds. Swipe it, Chloe said proudly. The cashier took the heavy metal card and inserted it into the chip reader. The machine processed for 3 seconds before letting out a sharp, angry beep. A bright red light flashed across the top of the terminal. The cashier frowned slightly and pulled the card out. I apologize, madam, the cashier said politely. It seems the chip reader did not register properly. Let me try swiping the magnetic strip. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh and looked directly into her phone camera. You guys see this? She complained, rolling her eyes. It is so exhausting dealing with outdated technology. Sometimes these systems simply cannot handle the massive limit on a black card. The cashier swiped the card through the side of the machine. The terminal processed for another agonizing 5 seconds. Then the exact same sharp, angry beep echoed through the quiet luxury boutique. The screen flashed bright red again, displaying a very specific automated warning code. The polite smile instantly vanished from the cashier's face, replaced by a look of serious professional concern. I am incredibly sorry, madam, the cashier said, lowering her voice slightly to avoid drawing attention. But this card has been completely declined by the issuing bank. Chloe stopped posing for the camera. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. Decline, she snapped loudly, grabbing the attention of 2 other wealthy shoppers in the store. That is absolutely impossible. Do you have any idea who my husband is? He is the chief executive officer of a $50 million tech company. Run the card again and this time push it through manually. The account has a limitless balance. The cashier stood her ground. She turned the digital terminal around so Chloe could see the glowing screen for herself. I cannot run the card again, madam. The system has automatically locked the account. The error message specifically states that the card has been declined due to an emergency asset freezing order. I am required by store policy to retain the physical card when a federal freeze code is flagged. Chloe stared at the red text on the screen. Asset freezing order. The words did not make any sense to her. She reached out and tried to snatch the heavy metal card out of the cashier's hand, but the woman quickly pulled it behind the counter. Give me my husband's card back right now, Chloe screamed, completely abandoning her sweet influencer persona. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands down on the glass display case. This is completely unacceptable. Get your manager out here right now. I am going to have you fired for embarrassing me in front of hundreds of thousands of people. But the hundreds of thousands of people watching the live broadcast were no longer leaving fire emojis and compliments. The comment section scrolling rapidly across Chloe's phone screen had suddenly turned incredibly dark. Users who were simultaneously reading the morning tech news were bringing the brutal reality directly into her livestream. Her eyes darted to the phone screen. A user named TechGuru88 commented, "The app just crashed globally. Read the news." Another user typed, "His startup just got hit with a massive intellectual property lawsuit. They are saying it is a total fraud." A third comment popped up reading, "Asset freeze means the government just locked his bank account, sweetie. Have fun flying economy." Chloe felt the color drain completely from her face. She snatched her phone off the counter and stared at the relentless wave of mocking comments. Her followers were laughing at her. They were watching her entire fake billionaire reality completely unravel in real time inside a duty-free shop. She let out a high-pitched scream of absolute frustration, entirely abandoning the expensive handbag and sprinting out of the boutique. Just a few yards away, inside the locked restroom of the first-class lounge, Marcus was still kneeling on the cold tile floor. He had not moved an inch. He was staring blankly at his shattered phone screen, listening to the busy signal buzzing from the broken speaker. N&C Holdings, he whispered out loud. The name echoed off of the marble walls, sounding like a terrible curse. He squeezed his eyes shut, and a vivid memory flashed instantly into his mind. He was sitting at the massive mahogany table in the expensive law firm. He saw his own smug, arrogant face reflecting in the glass. He heard his own voice dripping with cruel mockery as he threw the manila folder across the table. "Take that garbage company as a parting gift, Naomi." He remembered the way she had looked at him. She did not argue. She did not beg him to stay. She simply pulled out her expensive pen and read the clean break clause. She read the exact paragraph that legally stripped him of every single right he had to his own intellectual property. He remembered her beautiful, terrifying smile as she signed her name with a sweeping, elegant flourish. He had forced that garbage company onto her. He had ordered his own highly paid lawyers to expedite the paperwork. He had aggressively demanded the clean break clause to protect his $50 million venture capital deal. He had built the absolute perfect trap designed to completely destroy her, and then he had happily walked right inside and locked the door behind himself. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He was not the victim of a sophisticated corporate hacking scheme. He was not the target of a hostile billionaire takeover. He had literally handed the loaded gun to his ex-wife and begged her to pull the trigger. The restroom door suddenly rattled violently on its hinges. Chloe began pounding on the heavy wood from the outside, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Marcus, open this door right now!" Chloe shrieked, her voice completely hysterical. "The cashier just confiscated your black card. She said your assets are frozen. The internet is saying your company is a massive fraud, Marcus. Open the door." Marcus stayed on his knees. He did not answer her. He just kept staring at the shattered glass on the floor, fully realizing that the quiet, brilliant woman he had discarded had just successfully buried him alive without ever raising her voice. Marcus did not open the restroom door to comfort his screaming wife. He pushed past Chloe without saying a single word, completely ignoring her frantic demands about the confiscated credit card. He walked through the first-class lounge like a hollow shell of a man. His mind was racing through the wreckage of his shattered reality, trying to find a single thread of hope. He pulled his cracked phone from his pocket and opened the digitized divorce settlement. He scrolled past the clean break clause that had doomed him and zoomed in on the registered business address for N&C Holdings. He needed to find the corporate entity that had just stolen his empire. He needed to find the cheap lawyers Naomi must have hired to exploit his mistake. He sent a frantic text message to the family group chat, the same chat where they had spent the entire week mocking Naomi and celebrating their massive wealth. But the chat was no longer full of champagne emojis and victory speeches. Brad was leaving frantic voice notes screaming that his brokerage firm had just flagged a massive margin call on his leveraged trust fund. Shirley was typing in all capital letters because the bank had just called to verify the emergency freeze on her home equity line of credit. Marcus told them all to meet him immediately at the address listed on the legal documents. He promised them he was going to fix it. He promised them he would march into whatever run-down suburban strip mall Naomi was operating out of and demand his intellectual property back. 2 hours later, a chaotic fleet of rideshare cars pulled up to the curb in the very center of the downtown Atlanta financial district. Marcus stepped out onto the sidewalk looking completely disheveled. His expensive travel suit was wrinkled, and his face was pale with extreme panic. Brad jumped out of the next car, looking like he was about to have a massive heart attack. His pastel suit was soaked with nervous sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot. Shirley and Keisha scrambled out of the third vehicle. Shirley was clutching her designer purse to her chest, hyperventilating, while Keisha aggressively typed on her phone, trying to figure out why her credit cards were suddenly declining everywhere. "Where is the office?" Brad demanded, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder and shaking him violently. "My accounts are locked, Marcus. The bank is saying the tech company is completely insolvent. Where is the damn shell company that did this?" Marcus looked down at his cracked screen and then looked up at the towering structure right in front of them. It was not a run-down suburban office park. It was not a cheap co-working space or a shady virtual mailbox facility. It was the tallest, most prestigious glass and steel financial skyscraper in the entire city. It was a fortress of extreme wealth guarded by armed security and surrounded by luxury vehicles. "This has to be a mistake," Marcus mumbled, staring up at the massive glass tower. "She cannot afford an office here. The rent for a single desk in this building is more than her entire yearly salary. She must have just used a fake address to file the paperwork." "I do not care if she lives in the basement!" Brad screamed, pushing past Marcus and marching toward the massive revolving glass doors. "I want my $5 million back right now. I am going to find whoever runs this garbage shell company, and I am going to sue them until they are homeless." The four of them stormed through the revolving doors and marched directly into the sprawling marble lobby. The ceilings were 40 feet high, and the floors were polished to a mirror shine. Marcus marched up to the front security desk, completely ignoring the strict corporate decorum of the building. He slammed his hand down on the marble counter, demanding to know exactly what floor N and C Holdings was located on. He threatened to call the police if the security guards did not immediately hand over the contact information for the owners. The head security guard did not flinch. He slowly typed the company name into his terminal. He looked at Marcus and then looked at his computer screen. He did not ask for their identification or tell them they needed an appointment. "We have been expecting you all morning." The guard said, his voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of emotion. "You are cleared for the penthouse level. Please step into the private elevator on your far right. It is a direct express line." Marcus frowned deeply. He looked at Brad, who was wiping sweat from his forehead. None of this made any sense. A worthless shell company did not have an express elevator to the penthouse level of the most expensive commercial real estate building in the state. But they were too angry and too desperate to question the logic. They marched over to the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid open silently, and they all stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began its rapid ascent. The digital floor indicator climbed higher and higher, silently ticking past the floors occupied by international investment banks and global hedge funds. The silence inside the elevator car was absolutely suffocating. Shirley was clutching her chest, praying out loud that her house would not be foreclosed on. Keisha was nervously chewing her fingernails. Brad was pacing back and forth in the confined space, muttering violent threats under his breath. Marcus just stared blankly at the metal doors, trying to convince himself that he was still in control. He was the tech visionary. He was the chief executive officer. Whoever was waiting for them at the top of this building was going to face the full wrath of his brilliant legal team. The digital display hit the top floor. The elevator let out a soft, elegant chime. The heavy steel doors slowly slid apart. Marcus, Brad, Shirley, and Keisha braced themselves to storm into a small, cramped office and demand immediate justice. They were ready to scream and threaten and break things until they got their money back. But as the doors opened, they were instantly hit with a visual slap so violently jarring, it completely paralyzed their vocal cords. They did not step into a cramped hallway. The elevator doors opened directly into an absolutely breathtaking, sprawling corporate penthouse. The floors were covered in pristine white marble. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic sweeping view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The furniture was custom-crafted, imported leather, and solid mahogany. Original modern art hung on the walls, illuminated by soft gallery lighting. It was a space designed exclusively to intimidate billionaires. It was the physical embodiment of absolute untouchable power. And right in the center of the massive room, behind an enormous custom reception desk, was a solid wall of black Italian marble. Mounted directly onto the black marble were massive glowing gold-plated letters that spelled out a single devastating reality: Naomi and Co. Wealth Management. Marcus felt his entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. He stared at the glowing gold letters, completely unable to process what his eyes were showing him. Naomi. It was her name. Not a coincidence. Not a mistake. The garbage shell company he had thrown away was the holding entity for a massive wealth management empire. Brad stopped pacing, completely frozen in his tracks. His jaw dropped open as he stared at the sheer, unbelievable wealth surrounding them. Shirley stopped praying. Keisha dropped her phone. The extreme anger and entitlement they had carried into the elevator was instantly crushed into absolute terrified silence. Sitting behind the massive reception desk was Maya. She wore a tailored designer suit and a sharp, unforgiving smile. She looked at the four pathetic, disheveled people standing in her pristine lobby. "Welcome to Naomi and Co. Wealth Management," Maya said, her voice ringing clearly through the massive silent space. "The chief executive officer will see you now. Please follow me down the hall." Maya led the four of them down a long, wide hallway lined with expensive modern art and custom lighting. The only sound was the sharp, confident clicking of Maya's designer heels against the polished marble floor. Marcus followed her with heavy, dragging footsteps. Brad was breathing so loudly he sounded like a man having an asthma attack, while Shirley and Keisha clung to each other in absolute terrified silence. Maya reached the massive double doors made of solid imported oak at the very end of the hallway. She pushed them open effortlessly and stepped aside, gesturing for the family to enter the private office. They slowly walked into the room. The space was absolutely massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire corner of the building, offering an unobstructed view of the sprawling city below. I was sitting behind my custom mahogany desk, facing the massive windows with my back entirely turned to them. I could hear their nervous, shallow breathing echoing in the quiet room. I let them stand there for 10 agonizing seconds, soaking in the undeniable reality of my absolute power. Then I slowly swiveled my heavy leather chair around to face them. If this moment were being filmed, the camera would execute a violent snap zoom directly onto my face. I did not offer them a warm greeting. I did not look angry or bitter. My expression was completely flat, and my eyes were as cold as solid ice. I rested my hands on the polished surface of my desk and looked at the pathetic group of people who had spent the last week actively praying for my total destruction. Marcus stood at the front of the group looking like a reanimated corpse. His expensive travel suit was a wrinkled mess, and his face was slick with cold sweat. Brad looked completely unhinged, his pastel suit stained with perspiration, and his hands shaking violently at his sides. "What is this?" Naomi Marcus choked out his voice, sounding incredibly small and broken. "What kind of sick game are you playing right now? Turn the servers back on. You are destroying my company." I leaned back in my chair and stared at him with pure, unadulterated pity. "You do not have a company, Marcus," I said, my voice slicing through the silent room like a razor blade. "You have a completely empty digital box, and I am not playing a game. I am simply enforcing the strict legal boundaries that you aggressively demanded." Marcus stepped forward, slamming his hands down on the edge of my desk, just like he had done at the security counter downstairs. "You hijacked my servers," he screamed, a sudden desperate burst of adrenaline flooding his system. "You hacked into my cloud provider and filed a fraudulent intellectual property claim. I wrote that code. I built that brand. You cannot just steal my life's work because you are a bitter, jealous ex-wife. I will have my lawyers bury you under so many federal lawsuits you will never see the light of day. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I simply opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single manila folder. It was the exact same folder he had thrown at me in the corporate law firm. I tossed it lightly onto the center of my desk. You really thought you were a self-made genius, did you not? Marcus, I asked slowly, shaking my head. You truly believed that you manifested your empire through sheer brilliance and visionary talent. You were so busy doing interviews and attending high society parties that you completely forgot how this company actually started. You forgot about the terrible credit score you had 5 years ago. You forgot about the massive mountain of student debt that prevented any bank from even looking in your direction. Marcus stared at the manila folder, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. From day one, I used my own personal wealth to create N&C Holdings. I explained, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. I used my own pristine credit and my own capital to purchase the absolute rights to your source code before you even registered your startup. I paid the best intellectual property lawyers in the country to lock that code inside my holding company. And then, because I was a supportive wife, I drafted a master licensing agreement. I leased that incredibly valuable software to your shiny public-facing startup for exactly $1 a year. Brad let out a loud gasping sound. He was a financial broker. He understood exactly what a master licensing agreement meant. He understood that a company without proprietary ownership of its core technology was completely worthless. I did it to help you, Marcus. I continued, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his terrified face. I leased it to you for $1 a year to help you dodge massive corporate taxes and to strictly limit your personal liability if the startup failed. I protected you from your own incredible financial ignorance. You signed the lease agreement 5 years ago without ever reading the fine print because you have always been too arrogant to read the boring spreadsheets. You thought N&C was just a garbage shell company because you never bothered to look under the hood of your own supposed empire. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His legs began to tremble violently. And then you decided you needed to be free, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet whisper. You decided I was an anchor holding back your greatness. You hired an aggressive legal team, and you demanded a completely clean break. You wanted to make absolutely sure that I could never touch the $50 million your shadow venture capital firm was offering you. I reached out and tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick manila folder. You forced me to sign that clean break agreement, Marcus. You stood in that expensive conference room and you mocked me. You legally waived all current and future rights to any assets held by my solely owned entities. And because you explicitly demanded that complete separation, you instantly voided the master licensing agreement that allowed your startup to use my software. The heavy silence in the office was absolutely deafening. Shirley let out a quiet, whimpering cry, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. That means you legally handed 100% of the intellectual property back to its rightful owner, I said, offering him a bright, beautiful, terrifying smile. You legally returned the servers, the source code, the merchant gateways, and every single patent directly to N&C Holdings. I did not steal your life's work, Marcus. You literally wrapped it up in a legally binding bow and shoved it into my hands because you were too busy planning a massive wedding with a 26-year-old influencer. You built the guillotine, you polished the blade, and then you happily put your own head right on the chopping block and pulled the lever yourself. Marcus slowly collapsed, falling to his knees right in front of my mahogany desk. He looked exactly like he did in the airport restroom. He was a completely broken, shattered man. The arrogant tech chief executive officer was entirely dead, replaced by a weeping, pathetic shell who had just realized the true magnitude of his own colossal stupidity. The heavy silence in the office was broken only by the sound of Marcus gasping for air on the floor. He was clutching the edge of my mahogany desk as if it were a life raft, but he was already completely submerged. Shirley was openly weeping now. She had collapsed into one of the expensive leather guest chairs, sobbing into her hands as she realized her golden child had just destroyed his own life. Keisha stood frozen like a statue, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. But Brad refused to accept defeat. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the smartest guy in the room. He was a financial broker. His brain was desperately, frantically searching for any possible loophole or any shred of leverage he could use to regain the high ground. He could not accept that a black woman he had relentlessly mocked had just outsmarted him and his beloved tech genius brother-in-law. Brad stepped right over Marcus and marched up to my desk. His pastel suit was completely soaked with nervous sweat, and his face was flushed with a toxic mix of extreme panic and desperate rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you won, Naomi?" Brad stammered, his voice shaking violently. "You think you are so incredibly smart. But you are forgetting one massive detail. You still have that garbage house. You are still carrying a $2 million mortgage on a crumbling piece of property. Marcus completely washed his hands of that debt. You might have stolen the software, but you are still going to go completely bankrupt, paying off that massive loan on a consultant's salary. The bank is going to foreclose on that dump by the end of the year, and you will be out on the street." I looked at Brad's sweaty, desperate face. He was clinging to the mortgage debt like it was his final weapon. He truly believed he had found the fatal flaw in my master plan. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I simply let out a soft, genuine chuckle that echoed through the massive, quiet office. "Brad," I said, shaking my head slowly, "you really are the absolute worst financial broker in this entire city." I turned away from him and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a thick, bound legal document. It was much heavier than the divorce settlement. It was printed on high-quality premium paper and bound with thick black leather. I held it in my hands for a moment, letting Brad stare at it before I tossed it onto the center of my desk. It landed with a loud, heavy thud right next to the clean break agreement. "You all spent the last week laughing at me in that group chat," I said, leaning forward and resting my arms on the desk. "You told me to sell my crumbling house and go hide in the suburbs. You thought I was just a foolish, sentimental woman clinging to a rotting piece of family history." Brad stared at the thick, leather-bound document. His eyes darted nervously between the paperwork and my face. "But you never actually looked at the property records, did you, Brad?" I asked, my voice dripping with absolute cold authority. "You never bothered to check the zoning maps or the city development plans. If you were actually a good broker, you would have noticed that my family home sits on 22 acres of prime undeveloped commercial real estate right next to the new interstate highway expansion project." The color started to rapidly drain from Brad's face. The arrogant sneer he had worn since the day I met him was completely melting away. "For the last 2 years, while Marcus was busy attending red carpet events and you were busy pretending to be a Wall Street titan, I was quietly attending city council meetings," I explained. "I hired the best commercial real estate lawyers in Atlanta. I spent months aggressively lobbying the local government to officially rezone that entire acreage from residential to heavy industrial use." I picked up the heavy leather-bound contract and pushed it directly across the desk until it was touching Brad's trembling hands. "Oh, that piece of land you all mocked," I said, smiling brightly. "I just sold it to Amazon. They are tearing down the old house next week to build a massive automated fulfillment center. The final purchase price was $25 million in pure cash." Shirley let out a loud, gasping choke from her chair. Keisha actually stumbled backward, hitting the wall of the office. Marcus stopped gasping for air and slowly raised his head, looking at me with absolute sheer horror in his eyes. "The funds cleared into my private accounts yesterday afternoon." I continued, driving the final nail perfectly into the coffin. "I paid off the $2 million mortgage instantly. I used a fraction of the remaining profits to secure this penthouse office and set up my new wealth management firm. And the absolute best part of this entire transaction is that Marcus was in such a frantic, desperate rush to marry his young influencer that he explicitly waived all rights to my real estate in the clean break agreement." I looked down at Marcus, who was still kneeling on the floor. "Thanks for generously letting me keep the house in the divorce, Marcus," I said, my voice soft but incredibly lethal. "It really was an amazing parting gift." Brad stood completely frozen in front of my desk. The financial math was currently processing in his brain with brutal, devastating clarity. He was a broker. He understood numbers better than anyone else in the room. He realized that I owned 100% of the intellectual property that ran the payment application. He realized that I owned $25 million in liquid cash from the Amazon real estate deal. He realized that I was an incredibly wealthy, powerful woman holding all the cards. And then the final, most terrifying calculation hit him. If I owned the software, then the public-facing startup that Marcus managed owned absolutely nothing. The company was completely hollow. It had no assets. It had no proprietary technology. It had no venture capital funding. The startup was legally and practically worth $0. Brad slowly turned his head away from my desk. He looked down at Marcus. Brad had completely liquidated his grandfather's trust fund. He had taken out a massive second mortgage on his own home. He had aggressively bypassed all standard financial safety protocols because he wanted to get rich quickly. He had taken $5 million of his family's money, and he had handed it directly to Marcus just 3 days ago. Brad's eyes were completely bloodshot. The veins in his neck were bulging against his tight pastel collar. His chest was heaving with rapid, aggressive breaths. The realization hit him with the force of a physical explosion. His entire inheritance, his home, and his financial future had just been dumped into a completely empty digital shell. Marcus had sold him $5 million worth of absolutely nothing. Marcus looked up at his brother-in-law. The two men locked eyes. Marcus held his hands up slightly, trying to silently beg for mercy. But there was absolutely no mercy left in that massive, luxurious office. Brad's hands curled into tight, violent fists. The arrogant finance bro was gone, entirely replaced by a desperate, ruined man who had just lost everything he had ever owned. Brad did not hesitate. He lunged forward with a primal, deafening scream, entirely abandoning any remaining shred of his polished corporate persona. He grabbed Marcus by the collar of his expensive travel suit and hauled him forcefully off the marble floor. Before Marcus could even raise his hands to defend himself, Brad pulled his arm back and delivered a brutal, crushing punch directly to his brother-in-law's jaw. The sickening sound of knuckles hitting bone echoed loudly through the luxurious office. Marcus stumbled backward, crashing hard against a heavy leather guest chair and collapsing back onto the floor. But Brad did not let him go. He kept his tight, violent grip on the ruined fabric of the suit, pulling Marcus back up just to violently shake him like a rag doll. "You stole my money!" Brad screamed, thick spit flying from his mouth. "You took $5 million from my family. You took my grandfather's entire trust fund. You took the equity out of my house. I am completely bankrupt, Marcus. My entire life is ruined because I trusted a complete fraud. I am going to kill you." Keisha let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek and scrambled backward, pressing herself flat against the massive glass windows to avoid the violence. But Shirley did not rush forward to protect her precious golden child. The absolute reality of her own financial ruin had finally broken through her massive, lifelong delusions. She watched her son bleeding on the floor for exactly 1 second before her legs gave out entirely. She threw herself down onto the cold white marble right in front of my mahogany desk. Shirley began to wail. It was a loud, agonizing sound of absolute despair. She crawled forward and desperately tried to reach for my hand across the polished wood, but I slowly pulled my chair back completely out of her reach. "Naomi, please." She sobbed, heavy tears streaming down her wrinkled face and ruining her expensive makeup. "You have to help me. You have $25 million, Naomi. You are so incredibly rich now. Please buy my house back from the bank. Do not let them throw me out onto the street. I am an old woman. You used to love me like a daughter loves a mother. Please forgive us for everything we said." I looked down at the woman who had aggressively dragged her luxury suitcases across my hardwood floors just last week. The same woman who had told me I was not fit for high society and mocked me for burying my nose in boring spreadsheets. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I sat perfectly still in my heavy leather chair and watched the pathetic wolves violently turn on each other inside my pristine office. "You made your bet, Shirley," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. You bet the roof over your head on a man who could not even be bothered to read his own legal contracts. The bank will take your house, and I will not spend a single penny to stop them. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing ringtone cut through the chaotic sound of Shirley's desperate sobbing and Brad's violent screaming. It was coming from the pocket of Marcus's ruined suit jacket. Marcus was bleeding heavily from his split lip and gasping for air as Brad held him by the throat. With trembling, bloody fingers, Marcus pulled out his shattered smartphone and clumsily swiped the cracked screen to accept the call. He did not even have the chance to hold the device up to his ear before Chloe's hysterical shrieking blasted through the damaged speaker for everyone in the room to hear. "Marcus, you absolute pathetic liar!" Chloe screamed, her voice vibrating with pure rage. "The cashier at the duty-free shop just publicly humiliated me. My credit card was declined and confiscated. The federal authorities are already releasing statements about your massive asset freeze. My entire comment section is laughing at me. Every single tech blog is calling you a convicted fraudster and a massive scam artist. Chloe, please just listen to me." Marcus begged, his voice cracking pathetically as he tried to pry Brad's hands off his neck. "I can fix this. I just need to talk to the lawyers." "Do not tell me to listen to you!" Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs. "My publicist just dropped me, Marcus. Brand deals are completely canceling my contracts. I am not getting on that plane to the Maldives. I am not spending another second pretending to be your loyal wife. I already called my own attorney from the airport lounge. We are filing for an emergency annulment immediately. I refuse to be legally tied to a broke criminal. Do not ever contact me again." The line went completely dead. The sharp electronic dial tone filled the room, serving as the final devastating soundtrack to his absolute destruction. Marcus dropped the cracked phone onto the marble floor. He had no money. He had no company. He had no wife. And he was currently trapped in a room with a violent brother-in-law who wanted to destroy him and a mother who was begging his ex-wife for spare change. The dial tone rang out like a flatline on a heart monitor. Brad stared at Marcus with his fists still tightly clenched, but the fight had completely drained out of him. He was not a violent man by nature. He was just a pathetic coward who had finally realized he had lost everything. He let go of Marcus's ruined collar and backed away. His hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them deep into his pockets. Shirley continued to wail against the cold marble floor. Her desperate tears left wet streaks across the pristine stone. Keisha was hyperventilating by the windows, furiously tapping on her phone screen and watching her banking application display massive negative balances in real time. I watched the chaotic display of their absolute ruin without blinking a single time. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumphant joy. I did not feel the need to stand up and scream or gloat over their misery. True power does not need to raise its voice. True power simply observes the consequences of its own flawless execution. I reached across my polished mahogany desk and pressed the silver button on my secure intercom system. "Maya." My voice carried crisply through the speaker, completely cutting through the loud sobbing echoing in the room. "Please have security come up to the penthouse immediately and escort these people out of my office. Make sure they use the freight elevator on the way down. I have an important portfolio meeting with some billionaires at 3 o'clock, and I absolutely cannot have this tragic mess ruining the aesthetic of my lobby." "Yes, boss," Maya replied instantly, her voice dripping with cool professional satisfaction. "Security is already at your door." Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy oak double doors swung open. 4 large men in immaculate black suits stepped into the room. They did not ask questions, and they did not hesitate. They moved with swift, silent efficiency. 2 of the guards grabbed Brad by the arms and marched him toward the exit. He did not fight back. He just stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by his massive financial failure. Another guard, gently but firmly, pulled Shirley off the floor. She tried to reach out to me one last time, screaming my name, but the guard expertly guided her out into the hallway. Keisha followed close behind them, keeping her head bowed in absolute shame. Marcus was the last one left. He slowly picked himself up off the floor. His split lip was still bleeding, and his expensive tailored suit was completely destroyed. He looked down at the thick manila folder resting exactly in the center of my desk. He stared at the legal document that had legally stripped him of his entire tech empire. Then he finally looked up and met my eyes. There was no arrogance left in him. There was no smug superiority. There was only the hollow, empty stare of a man who realized he had built a massive castle directly on top of a landmine and then gladly handed me the detonator. He turned around without saying a single word and walked out of the office, following the security guards into the hallway. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind him. The absolute perfect silence returned to my office. The camera slowly returns to the exact same continuous movement from the very beginning of the story. It executes a slow parallax arc gliding smoothly around my profile. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up a fresh glass of dark red wine that Maya had quietly left on the side table. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, bitter flavor coat my tongue. I looked down at the tiny cars crawling through the busy downtown Atlanta traffic. They looked like insignificant little ants from this towering height. When your enemies hand you a rope, do not get mad. Do not scream and cry and beg them to treat you with the respect you actually deserve. Just take the rope, smile politely, and walk away in absolute silence. Because if you give an arrogant fool enough time and enough rope, they will always build their own gallows. All you have to do is sit back, pour yourself a glass of wine, and patiently wait for them to hang themselves with their own absolute greed.